sorry if I'm late.
You're just on
I
time.
was talking to my daughter on the way here on the phone, which was nice.
And we'll get started with the class in a minute or two. I normally hear from Nicole when she's not coming, so I'm pretty sure Nicole's on her way. I think Wendy's
she's on
coming.
her way.
She sent us an email with some stuff that she wanted to talk about. We'll see if she's coming.
I thought she might not be coming.
Nicole's zooming in.
Oh, she is? Okay.
Nicole's what?
Zooming in.
Oh, good.
She's not coming in. Not
Okay.
a car.
Where is it?
Her has a car.
Okay. Oh, wow, yeah, her daughter. Wow.
Her daughter
Her
has a car.
daughter, yeah.
All right, Johanna. So do you want to start with the Triple H or should we do a story? And then I think we should start with the Triple H. This is our 5th week. We've done enough unpacking these stories. And then I think by going into the Triple H, the Helpmates, Harlots and Heroes,
Yep.
you know, that way we can start to maybe understand different, you know, theories about how we interpret and use this stuff before we do
Okay.
the 2 we're going to do tonight.
And did we want to also talk about more about the wilderness when we're done Triple H as well, or did you want to save that for another
Let me
week?
think about that one. I think I can talk about that in the context of the Tamar story because of the way she gets
Okay.
sort of cast out. Yeah. If I
Okay.
forget that by the time we get there, remind me of that. Yes.
All right. Well, good to see everybody, and it's always good to be with everybody. And I'm gonna hold the floor a little bit to
I will.
hi Wallace, hi Nicole.
Hi.
Hi.
Although I've never seen you.
Yep. Move us through some of the Triple H themes, thanks to Nicole's, right? Triple H. We're gonna
I
keep
love
doing that,
that.
Nicole.
That's
Yeah,
great.
Triple H. And there's a lot in that first introduction, and the things that jumped out to me that I thought I would just share was her overview of the history of feminist studies of the scriptures, which, as somebody who is in the field, I always appreciate kind of learning from the history of feminists who have tackled this stuff. So there's 3 eras that she talks about that I'll highlight. And then she also brings us back to the concept of patriarchy itself. So I thought maybe we would just spend a minute talking about those features and situating the rise of patriarchy, you know, as related to the tales. And then she says a few words about feminist hermeneutics, which was really interesting to me. She shares 3 different perspectives. She lands on one.
Yeah.
So we can talk a bit about that, and then she talks about what might be the differences between biblical law and actual legal codes and the lived experiences of women in ancient Israel before the monarchy, during the monarchy, and after. And again, as someone who's a macro person, those historical tidbits were just really interesting to me. So that's what I'm going to talk more about, and then you all are going to jump in whenever you want, and then we'll talk about the tale. So I was really interested to learn that feminists jump in critiquing scripture and actually using scripture as early as the first wave women's movement. So in the 1800s, she talks about in really as early as the 1830s and 40s, 1840s, women's rights activists were really taking on biblical interpretations as they were used to further patriarchy. So a multiracial movement of feminist women that were really calling on all of us, right, to reinterpret the scriptures in ways that did not denigrate women. So, and I'm sure, you know, many in the room already know that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 1880s, actually sets forth to write the Women's Bible.
Yeah.
Just so, you know, sort of raising up some of these, you know, landmark moments.
Johanna, Margaret Fuller writes about it in Women in the 19th Century. The Peabody sisters, who are actually related to Ralph Waldo Emerson, you know, are right about it in the 1830s. So it has a Unitarian connection, this feminist-based criticism in the 19th century.
Love it, love it. We're gonna amend that right now. We're gonna call up, right? We're gonna call up Ellis on that. I was also interested to learn that it was not until 1894 that we have the first woman become a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, which was considered really the establishment of biblical scholarship. And that many of the early feminist Christian women who weighed in were not necessarily part of the profession itself, but were also part of larger feminist movements that we have learned a lot about in our lifetime, and so that that period really up until the 1960s, so a little bit over a century of women who were calling for reinterpretations, but that in the 1960s, she argues, more voices are heard, right? So we start to get important literature. Women and Religion, was published by Margaret Crook in 1967 with Elsie Culver. We get who was a church worker, a professional, wrote Women in the World of Religion. So there starts to get a head of steam in the 1960s, and that leads into really what she'll call the second era, or a second important phase where feminist hermeneutics will really kick off, she says, and get momentum. So hermeneutics, a fancy word for interpreting text, giving meaning to, but Reverend Scott, I'll let you say more fancy definitions, but do you want to go ahead and add another sentence to hermeneutics? And we don't have to spell it, right? Do we have to spell in public?
No, and it won't be on the final exam. Hermeneutics is simply the interpretive lens that you use to understand something. It's a Greek word, but it's not an ancient Greek word. The other thing I'll say about her little piece on hermeneutics there is, this text was originally published in 1994. Which was really the sort of the crest of the wave of postmodernism, as it was really, trying to find its way into all branches of knowledge. We've sort of moved beyond that a little bit, and she makes a claim in the part of the text that says hermeneutics in the very second sentence. She says, the insights that dominate biblical scholarship today. Well, that today is 1994. Is the recognition that neutral objective readings of texts are a myth, and that's not. We're not quite. We still. I think we have a more nuanced view of that particular claim, and I think it's important to remember that. I think postmodernism began to suggest not only is it hard to know the truth, but that there is no truth. So and I think now we're talking about truths plural, and how do we liberate a truth from what we're investigating that can be liberatory.
Right. And then also the critiques that postmodernism really went off the rails with the multiple truths, and trying to dial back around that in terms of what that means for making any claims about liberation or power or justice if we have no truth. So I totally hear you on the on the historical carving out. So we might be in phase 4 then, and not because she's moving then from that second phase, which doesn't really takes for granted sort of more essentialist notions, or taking a look at what is the sexism embedded in the text, and not looking actually at the third phase, which you're saying, Reverend Scott, is really deconstructing the ways in which knowledge is produced, and the authority itself
Yes.
of the text. Yeah, okay. So she'll end it there, in that third phase, and then so would you say we are in phase 4 then, Reverend Scott, or are we in phase 5? I mean, are we how far away do you think we are?
I'm too far removed from the academy to make any, but I hope we're in a transition time. Postmodernism provided some useful tools, but I'm hoping to see what's next. But
yeah. So I really appreciate that, just thinking about the history of kind of what we're doing here, right? So the roots of what this group is actually doing, for me to think that those roots go all the way back, at least, right, to women's suffrage, and in a way that was, multiracial. I super appreciated just a little bit of a lens on that. And I also appreciate her raising up, the context of patriarchy, and, thinking about when we first gathered, and knowing what Frymer-Kinsky is also saying, in terms of patriarchy as a social system that actually predates the tales that we're reading about, and don't create the system, but are reflective, and that was helpful. But I wanted to just come back again to, what are some of those structural components of patriarchies, and she says some of this, but not all of it. So I'm just going to add in some things that I've put on the table before, but some of the key, elements of patriarchies, and not to suggest there's just one kind, right? But as we've been talking about, the control of women's reproduction, the control of their sexuality, the control of their labor in other ways, right? And the use of violence to enforce those distributions of resources, and control, which he talks about in this chapter, and we've talked, and it relates directly to this tales that we've been reading, and certainly for today, right? So I just wanted to return to what I think is such a key part of our engagement with these tales, is understanding patriarchy, and understanding how they are related to economic systems, and in fact are engines of them, and also racialized structures, as well as nation. And one of the things we haven't talked about yet is, when might then these systems have emerged in human civilizations, if they were here when these tales have been told. And what scholars will say, and Foxy, I know this is your area as well, is that we really don't see patriarchies emerging until their human civilizations have surplus that can be distributed, and societies have to find a way to decide who gets the extra stuff. And that does not happen until settled agriculture, which is why, right, in some of these tales it's already here because they've settled, and that transition takes a long time. But we know that horticultural societies in the main did not have strong patriarchies, in part because they did not have surpluses, right? And certainly nomadic societies, by virtue of, like, you can't sit around, there's no, we talk about there's no refrigerator, right, to hold your stuff. But there is also a lot of historical, anthropological, archaeological, sociological research that talks about the relationship between patriarchies and the rise of militarized societies, right? Settled militaries, right? So when societies become, or need to, or do become warrior societies, then you start to see an equation of women's roles as mothers, right? To not only reproduce humans that will work the land, or right, sustain the communities, but also will be soldiers. And so and then the coercion or the enticement of boys, men to be soldiers, and women to produce them. And so there's a ton of evidence that overlays, right? When do we start to get patriarchy? You could argue, well, it's capitalism, and I see your hand, Reverend Scott, or, it's connected to racialized societies, but race comes so much later. But even when you look at the origins of capitalism as relationship to patriarchies, it's really militaries, right? It's really about empire and violence. And I just wanted to tee that up, because it'll connect again to some of the stuff that to what we've been reading, and us trying to grapple with violence, right? And control of sexuality and reproduction, and the why, right? Why would societies have these kinds of controls? I mean, thinking of the story we read, thinking of Dinah, right? The story of Dinah for today. I mean, there's just so much, among many other things we could say, but I'll put a pause in it there, Reverend Scott, because I know, and then I see Wendy's hand. So go ahead, and you'll see I'm not good with the blended courses. I'm not good. I'm an in-person lady. So, you got to shout out.
Hey, you caught my hand pretty fast, so that's good.
Okay, all right. I see Wendy's too. All right.
So let's all take a deep breath. That was fabulous, Johanna. You just gave us a whole lot And so I just want to make sure we're leaving room for folks to ask questions or to highlight things from the text that they saw. The only two things that I would add, well, I'll hold one of them because it'll come in later. But the only thing that I'll add is, you know, some of the recent archaeological evidence is starting to suggest that, you know, any place that there was a surplus, it didn't always come from agriculture. There's evidence of coastal societies in Western North America where they had an abundance of trading and fishing. I guess it was maybe considered fishing agriculture or something. But any place where they, you know, they didn't have to, you know, press that forward was opened up for, you know, okay, how are we going to organize ourselves? They had a chance to sit around and say, how are we going to organize our lives, and who's going to be in charge and who makes the rules? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Yep.
But I think that, and this is something that Helen and I were talking about this afternoon, which is how being a mother interrupts people's lives, women's lives. And I think that, you know, during ancient times, women did not have control over their reproduction. They got pregnant. There was no birth control, or at least I don't know of any birth control. And I would think that would limit the way women operated. And I mean, if you look at Queen Elizabeth I, you know, the reason why she was so powerful was because she didn't marry and she didn't have children, and she became the Virgin Queen. And I think there is something to that, like the limitations that is brought just by biology, whether we want to admit it or not. But the other thing is the way in which women operated as warriors from the text, which I found fascinating. And it's being sort of sneaky about it, not being upfront about being a warrior. You know, I think it was, and I cannot pronounce, and I don't want to bash the name Yael, who, how do you pronounce her name?
Yael.
Yael. She kills the guy when he's asleep, right? And it seems so she comes off very motherly with him. You know, she puts a blanket on him, she does all these things, and then he falls asleep, and then she takes her pickaxe and she, you know, puts a nail in his head. And then you have Judith, who is using her sexuality, her beauty, in order to seduce. So the way in which women are depicted as warriors, or as people who have the power to diminish the enemy, is very different than the way men tend to be depicted and treated as warriors. Theirs is much more surreptitious than a man's thing. And I do feel, I mean, on a personal level, I was a stay-at-home mom for 7 years. And when I got divorced, was declared a displaced homemaker. I'm living in the 20th and 21st century, and I couldn't figure out how to do both. So I cannot imagine ancient women being, and I'm like a feminist to my core, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. So.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah. Helen Tand is
So
over here.
I was listening, and I guess, so we did have this conversation. It started with, I was talking about the film, The Lost Daughter.
Okay, I haven't
And
seen
well,
it.
it just how it kind of stayed with me, because it's about ambivalence, about motherhood. It's something that really usually isn't covered very much in the media. And I started talking about how I felt some of that as struggling to, for my case, starting a career. I had my kids pretty young and I was going to night school and doing all these things. But I'm wondering if these women, early women, had a society of women to care for kids in many cases. So I don't think they faced the same kinds of things as we're talking about today. And then, although I don't really know that for sure, but things I've read about and stuff, I feel like there was more of that. And the other thing is, I agree, I was struck too by the way these women were secretive and sneaky to kill. But part of that also is that men are stronger than women physically, and women couldn't kind of walk up to someone that easily and just kill them. So I think that might have been, there's, aside from, there is the whole patriarchy as well, how they're taught to behave, but there's also the sheer men are stronger physically, and that, you know.
And you know, one of the things that, well, maybe it's helpful, Reverend Scott, if since we're on the you know, the conversation about what it might have been like in ancient Israel, maybe I'll do things a little bit out of order from her chapter and just talk about some of the highlights, and then we can come back to the hermeneutics, right, typology, if you want to do it that way, and then we could go into the tales more. That makes sense.
I think there's only one more thing I wouldn't mind us connecting with two things. One thing I sort of extracted from this introduction, and the other thing is what you wanted to present, that third way that Ogden-Ellis bases on Fiorenza. All right, so I'll go first. You present the bit on Fiorenza. We don't need to talk about the two modes that she's not using. We'll just talk about Fiorenza. We'll keep it simple. So there's a place in this, and I'm sorry that I don't know the page number, but it's in the section, I think, assessing differing interpretations, towards the bottom of the third page of that, and she's citing a feminist interpreter named Kathleen Farmer, and what she tries to remind us is that, you know, we modern readers ought not to expect the biblical writings to conform to our own literary notions of propriety, meaning that, you know, so there's different things at stake when you're reading literature from another culture, and especially when it's from an ancient time. So obviously there's going to be differences in values and differences in what does the culture hold to be of high esteem and of worth. But there's also the simple way that different cultures tell stories. And I was blessed to take a linguistics class with a man named Stephen Martin in Baltimore. And so the US culture is pretty much a linear story arc, just the facts, ma'am story. You know, there's a beginning, middle, and the end. There's not a whole lot of variation. Then, for instance, Irish culture kind of likes to tell a story and then to wander, but then
I can't see it.
oh, you may have to see it. It wanders in an arc. It wanders in an arc and goes away from the central core, but then comes back. And then other cultures have different ways of mapping this out. I couldn't find a good tool for this to share with you. I would have drawn it on the board if I was there. But the point is not everyone tells the story the same way. Cultures tell stories in different ways. For instance, there's the adage about when you're speaking to someone from a Bedouin Arab culture, if you ask him a question about something, he'll tell a story about an olive tree or a fig garden. He's still answering your question, but there's a cultural value of indirectness that you're supposed to be paying attention to find the answer in the story. And so that's why sometimes these biblical tales become even harder to unpack, because we're expecting the beginning, the middle, and the end, and all the details, because especially in American culture, it's a just the facts, ma'am, kind of narrative arc that we expect. Back to you.
That's a great point. That's a great point.
And I appreciate the on St. Patrick's Day, Rev, the shout out to the Irish people in our labyrinth ways in the room here. Although you wouldn't know it from my just the facts here, ma'am, way I'm going through this thing. So, you know, one of the other things that was interesting to me, as you heard me say, was I did appreciate learning, even within feminist hermeneutics, this, you know, she carves out these 3 different approaches. And as Rev Scott said, you know, we don't need to go through all 3, but, you know, she lands on right before the section that says methods of interpretation, right, the third. And if you would allow me to do some actual reading out of this, I think it might be helpful. And then Reverend Scott actually would appreciate some translation, you know, as well. But so she says, her definition right at the top of the page, a critical feminist hermeneutics of liberation, which is what she's adopting, and I think is what we're using in this class, actually, therefore abandons the quest for a liberating canonical text and shifts its focus to a discussion of, and she emphasizes this, a process of biblical interpretation that can grapple with the oppressive as well as the liberating functions of a particular biblical text in women's lives and struggles. And I just really appreciate that. And by the way, she's actually quoting Schuler, Forenza. So actually it's not, you know, it's she's borrowing from that. But I really appreciate that as someone who's new to trying to understand scripture and, you know, bringing a feminist lens. And she says then that way of looking has 4 quote unquote key moments that also resonated with me. Of course, the first one, a hermeneutics of suspicion. Anyway, the second, a hermeneutics of historical interpretation and reconstruction. I appreciated that. Okay, so how do we have kind of a critical eye on the authority of the actual tales? But then also, how do we look at it within, if I'm reading this correctly, a historical interpretation and try to reconstruct that? I mean, this is sort of Helen, you know, Helen, your question about our women, did they have other women to support them? We're sort of doing it right there. Or Wendy, your point about like, well, how would it be? You know, like, how did that happen in ancient Israel? How did it happen? And then she says also that the third is a hermeneutics of ethical and theological evaluation, which I think we've been doing as well, right? Like, was it okay, right, you know, for her to kill all the royal sons last week? And then last, a hermeneutics of creative imagination and ritualization, which I also think we've been doing in the class, right? How can we creatively think about the women in these tales in ways that might be helpful or inspiring to us today? And so I just thought that those 4 key quote unquote moments, and she says more about each one of those in the paragraphs below. But I just thought that that really jumped out at me, right, as a helpful way of kind of understanding how, you know, personally, how I might, and I'm just curious what other people thought about that, if that resonated with you, or and if Rev Scott, if there's things that are worth saying more about in that passage, please as well.
No, the only thing I'd lift up is the last one, the hermeneutics of ritualization is what we do as a congregation. That's what we do. That's how we take our interpretation and our work and we work it into Sunday morning worship. That's how we work it into public proclamation or social justice witness. That's how we work it into hopefully how we behave with one another and select our leadership and all that stuff.
Got it. Thanks. So again, I don't know.
I'm not clear on suspicion. And maybe it's because I came in a little late. You had covered that already.
No, the way I don't think so. I think you didn't miss anything. The way, well, she says in her definition, she says, which is the next paragraph, a hermeneutics of suspicion, quote, scrutinizes the presuppositions and interest of the interpreters and those of biblical commentators, as well as the androcentric strategies of the biblical text itself. And so I interpret that to mean not taking the text literally, right, as the word of, you know, whether it's God or the word of, you know, the authors as to, you know, what it means, you know, to us as women should, the women shoulds. You know, that's how I read that we should be critical of it as an authority over women's lives. And so,
Which we
all right, I'm
are.
reading. So
Which we
Foxy's
are.
comment, I don't have someone who has better glasses can read that.
Foxy shares, yes, that biblical women did have other women to help with women's work, dual wives, leveration, which we read about in the Tamar story, sisters-in-law, servants and slaves. The time when women were less likely to have help is if they were in a very, very small household or there was conflict among the women. And of course, yeah, so that's what Foxy's lifting up.
Thank you, Fox.
That was
And
to
how-
Helen. That was particularly to Helen because she raised the question.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Right.
No problem.
But people have very short lifespans, despite what the Bible tells us.
Yeah,
And,
lifespan at that point was probably between 35 and 45, depending on your cultural milieu and the weather.
right.
Say
And
nothing about the fact
childbirth,
that a large proportion of women died in childbirth.
Yes.
yep. So that was a great weakening, element here. I just want to say this, it has nothing to do with anything except the world. But I found out by listening to this, it was a 45-minute interview on PBS that was done with this great journalist, really funky woman. And she brought up the fact that Putin is 70 and that most men in Russia don't live to be 70. And I was really quite amazed about that there's a short lifespan with most Russian men. So, and they're definitely going back to the women of the Bible, a very short lifespan for women in the Bible. So ancient women.
Ancient men. Still with us.
Yeah.
Well,
And
ancient medicine may not have been anywhere near as happenstance and unsuccessful as we're led to believe. Some of the most, actually, Otter can vouch for this. We've gone back to herbals in large part because they do a better job than the allopathic.
Mhm.
The medication I turned her onto when I had COVID that my nephew got for me, I guarantee it's going to knock out COVID, but you're not going to find it in the hospital.
Yeah, well,
It's good for everything.
what is it? Yeah,
It's called crud cutter. Stuff is excellent.
Crud killer,
Crud-
crud killer, and it's from Avon Herbs in Columbus. I'll write it out.
Okay.
It tastes like the worst thing possible.
Yeah, it tastes horrible, but it does the job.
I love the name.
Yeah, right. Well,
Okay.
speaking of short time period, to follow Wendy's point, and we have we have Deborah and Yael, we have Tamar, which I always thought was Tamar, so thank you, and Dinah, and so I don't want to shortchange any of those tales.
So we're probably
but,
going to leave the warriors till next week. We're going to focus
Okay.
on Tamar and Dinah today. There's just so much there. I'm not going to pretend we can get through it all. I'm going to just say one thing to wrap up a response to the introduction and let you tie a bow on it, and then we'll move on to Tamar. All right. So towards the end, Ogden-Ellis reminds us, sad that she has to, but she reminds us that biblical women are people of color, right? And she goes this because she's trying to remind folks not just of being aware of our own situation, but of seeing the wrong kind of parallels in the text. And then the last sentence in there, this is before the section marked selection criteria. She says that as we study women of the Hebrew Bible, we will take note of those whose ethnic identity is clearly African, because obviously some of them are African and some of them are Middle East, and she wants to in this text focus on that. But she says we will also celebrate the ethnic diversity that is present in the ancient Hebrew community, because I think one of the things that often gets mistaken when we imagine and discuss ancient peoples is we don't realize how diverse many of their communities were, especially in a place like Israel, which is the crossroads of the ancient world. People going from Asia from Europe to Africa had to go through. People going from Asia to Europe or Africa had to go through. I mean, people, all the peoples of the world come through. And part of this is probably what makes keeping themselves separate and identified as a distinct people so important, because not only are there nations around them, there's all kinds of strangers coming through all the time. So that's just wanted to lift that up, as I thought it was a really nice setup by Ogden-Ellis.
Right, but they didn't segregate themselves by color, right?
No, by tribe.
Yeah,
by tribe or
but not-
nation. Yeah. It wasn't by color
Right.
necessarily. No.
Right.
Even, well, stop and think about it. Even your Turks, unless you happen to know that they're Turkish, you probably can't tell them from Middle Eastern.
Right.
But the vast majority of the people that are passing through here all have essentially the same bloodlines, the same different general appearance. Their names may vary because of where they come from or how they track their lineage, but they're all Middle Eastern.
Yeah.
Even the Egyptians, I mean, how many Egyptians were the offspring of slave women who were conquered and brought there?
Mhm. And Nubians, right?
Yeah.
Nubians.
Well,
were
the Nubians are from the far south. They're
Right.
black.
They're
Mhm.
black.
And the
But
Cushites from
the-
even farther south. Yeah. Mhm. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
But the Egypt of the times that we're talking about was primarily to the north.
Yes.
So they would look more like an Arab
Mhm.
than they would an African.
Okay.
So you really don't have a huge amount of differentiation in terms of appearance.
All right. That's true. And of course, once Egypt expands and there's a North and the South Kingdom, it becomes even more mixed. All right. Anything to wrap this up, Johanna?
Yeah. Okay, well, a couple things I wanted to say about the intro before we get into details, and also some things to just throw in as to think about generally, especially since I won't be able to be with you all next week. So I'm just going to get my 2 cents in here. But I thought it was really interesting to point out that she's raising up some of the distinction between what might have existed as a sociologist, what we would call culture, meaning the set of ideas, whether they're formal or informal, right? And structure, right? So, Social 101, right? So societies have positions, which aren't the people, and they have ideas, which also aren't the people. And then there's the people, right? Who actually engage in a set of ideas and a set of positions, and they don't always match up. Right, is the point I'm making. And so she makes a really good point in here are the biblical codes in ancient Israel, here's the law, and here's everyday women's lives. And in many ways, what's happening in their lives does not always match up directly with what the law was, or whether biblical or legal. And I think it's just so important, right, to keep that in mind, that it looks like in some instances, women actually may have had more agency or less, right, in relation to the laws and so that's all in there, and we don't, you can go back and kind of put your eyes on it again. But that really also seemed very important to me as someone who is a sociologist.
And also their belief system. So this goes back, Helen, to what we were talking about today, about did they believe stuff, right? Remember we were talking about that? And this goes back, did people believe these stories? Did they believe that there was a God? Was there some doubt there? What constituted a loyal Jew? All of those types of things. Again, there is theory, there was what was written, and there was how people actually behaved.
Well, the other thing too we have to remember is anything that was written in Genesis and Exodus predates Jewish law. Jewish law is in Leviticus.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're talking about Tamar and Leah and Rivka and Sarah and Hagar, they all predate Jewish law.
Okay.
They predate the Ten Commandments.
Hmm.
So you've got a whole different, they don't really have their own codification of law yet. They have the traditions of the cultures they came out of.
Mhm.
Oh, that's super helpful, Patsy.
Yeah,
Thank you. Yeah.
that's a perfect setup in many ways. I mean, yeah, because what we see is that in the Tamar story, which is we're going to go to now, it's 264 in the Frymer-Kinsky. The Tamar story is this is pre the Israelite state, right? This is before the Israelite people are sort of settled. They're still a nomadic people, as we see in the Dinah story. I almost said dinosaur. And the Dinah story, that they're wanderers, they're nomads, they're desert folk that wander from place to place for grazing land, etc. And they have a certain ferocity. And this has been borne out in some more contemporary archaeological research, that the folks in the city, where the words city and civilization have the same root word in English, the word urbane sort of meaning refined, coming from our notions of the city, and the people outside of the city, in order to express their power and to probably ward off those who might want to try and overrun them, developed a certain ferocity and like to be known as people who would defend themselves with force and vigor. And we'll see more of that when we get to the Dinah story. So here in the Tamar story, we're going to just sort of walk through this a little bit. I really want everyone to comment on this, not just because I'm not feeling well, but I hear myself talk all the time. So here we go. So on page 264, we get introduced to it. It happened at that time, Judah went away from his brothers. He headed for an Adulamite man named Hirah. There Judah saw the daughter of a Canaanite man. Her name was Shua. He took her and came into her. They're rather direct in the Bible, it seems. She conceived and gave birth to a boy, and he called his name She conceived again, gave birth to a boy, and she called him Onan. She did it again and gave birth to a son. She called his name Shelah. It was in Kezib that she bore him. Judah took a wife for his eldest heir, and her name was Tamar. All right. And so there's the beginning of the story. And, Frymer-Kinsky tries to set this up, that Tamar is important in so many ways. And we find out later in the biblical record that one of the reasons she's important is because she becomes a mother to the line that eventually becomes King David.
Mhm.
So here we have this notion that it happened at that time. It's like, okay, here we go. It's like that old genre use of a short phrase to let us know, pay attention, something big is about to happen. And we're learning here because the Israelites do not have their own land. Unlike what we were reading about with Ezra last week and all that, the only place to get wives for these men at this part of the biblical story is from outside of their own, because they're very small. And so all of these wives will come from without and be brought in. And Frymer-Kinsky speaks more eloquently about that towards the end of this. And so let's just go to the next piece of this tale, which is on 266. And here's where it starts to get a little interesting. Judah's eldest, was evil in Yahweh's eyes, and Yahweh killed him. We're not told what he did, but he did it, and poof.
He broke the rules.
Broke the rules. There you go. And so Judah said to Onan, now Judah is Onan's father. Judah says, come into your brother's wife, perform the Levirate act, and raise up seed for your brother. The Levir is the surrogate father. It can be a brother or the father of the original husband. So that's the Levirate act.
I just love that. I had never heard that concept, and that I just think it's a hoot, and especially that once she conceives, you can't go near her anymore. But it's just like, this is okay, just.
Well, is
like-
that how the best man started in wedding traditions?
Is that how what?
That's what I was told. The
But
best
I don't
man
know that.
started-
That would be an interesting investigation. I have no idea if that's the best man. It's supposed to be the brother or the father of the husband, but yeah.
I would bet she's right.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. All right, so Onan knew that the seed would not be for him. So in other words, with the levirate act, any children Tamar would have had through Onan, it still would have been as if it was of the firstborn, because Tamar was married to Er, who's the oldest. So so Onan would have been creating an economic rival by doing what his father told him. So Onan knew the seed would not be for him, and it happened that as he came to his brother's wife, he ejaculated on the earth without giving seed for his brother. What he did was evil in Yahweh's eyes, and finish the sentence. Sorry. So Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, sit as a widow in your father's house until Shelah, my son, grows up, for he thought, lest he too die like his brothers. So Tamar went and sat in her father's house. And so what we realize from the story is Judah here, it can seem cruel, but he doesn't know. He doesn't know what his oldest son did for Yahweh to kill him. And he doesn't know that Onan did not finish the command he gave him to father a child with his dead brother's wife. He just thinks maybe this woman's cursed, or maybe, who knows? But I already got one son left. So this is unusual in this culture to just send this widow out of the household when there's still the father-in-law and a brother left. Sorry, it's left over from never mind. So the death of Er presents the first critical juncture of the story. How will Tamar's fertility be actualized? And so anyway, it explains on page 267, just 3 sentences in, a levir provides an heir for his childless dead brother by inseminating the brother's widow. So we learn about this. And then at the same time, this is at the bottom of the page, she reminds us that Judah is the man of power in this situation, right? But he really condemns Tamar to like a life of nothingness. She doesn't really have a household that's her own. She doesn't have the promise of being kept within the security and future of her dead husband's family. And I love the phrase Frymer-Kinsky uses at the end of the last full paragraph of 267. It shows that a man with both power and a lack of understanding becomes an oppressor. And it'd be really good for us to remember that, as I think most of you do. And so then we're going to keep moving with the story.
Yeah, that really stood out to me too.
Say that again?
No, I was just saying that really stood out. It's Nicole. I was just saying that really stood out to me, like, because it's so universal and so eternal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you put
Right.
And without power often becomes an oppressor.
That's right.
Yep.
That's right.
And this also is a passage that some religious groups use over and over again about birth control,
That's right.
and abortion. Time and time again, this is what they'll bring up. You can't waste the sperm. This is a sin.
That's right. Monty
And so-
Python did that funny song about that in The Life of Brian, right? Every sperm is sacred,
Right.
making fun of that stupid theology, right?
Right. And so, yeah, this is where it all comes from.
That's right.
And it's also the rights of kings, right? So Debbie Ann brought up about the best man, but I bet you this is also where the rights of kings comes from, because a king could get any woman in his serfdom, or the Lord could take any woman on her wedding night.
Yeah, prima noche.
Right, right.
Wow.
What do they call?
Prima noche, first night.
Yep.
Prime noche.
Oh,
right.
boy.
All right. And so here we go, we're on 268 now. We're going to continue with the biblical text. And what Randy was referred to is actually talked about in some circles as onanism, the spilling of the seed anywhere but where they think it should go. And yeah. All right. So I love where Frymer-Kinsky says, this is the Bible's vision of the battle days before the state. So because in the what the biblical text seems to show, and that's another argument, is that once the state is established, there seems to have been some way to appeal to some authority outside of a household where a particular patriarch might have been being abusive and particularly terrifying. But when before the state, that's it. I mean, whatever the head of the household says, that's what's going to happen, and there's no authority to appeal to outside of the house. All right, we're going to read the rest of this at the bottom of 268, or I am. The days grew many. Bathsheba, Judah's wife, died. Judah was consoled, and he went to his sheep shearers, and he and his friend Hira the Adullamite to Timnah. Thus was told to Tamar, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. She took off her widow's garments. She covered herself with a scarf and was concealed. She sat at the eye opener, supposed to be a name of a place near on the Timnah road. And for she saw that Shelah had grown and she hadn't been given to him as a wife. Judah saw her and thought her a prostitute, for she had covered her face. And he headed toward her on the road and said, let's do this. I will come into you. Very interesting pillow talk, I'll say. All right. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law.
That'll seduce any woman. that got me.
Thank you so much, Wendy. I needed that laugh. She said, what will you give me if you come into me? Oh, and the negotiation. And this is classic in Jewish literature, not just in the Bible, but in the Midrash and the Talmud. You know, there's negotiating with someone higher in power than you. You see it happen with God a lot, but here it's Tamar and Judah. What will you give me if you come into me? I will send a goat from the flock. If you give me a pledge until you send it, so I need, I'm supposed to take your word, right? What pledge should I give you? Your seal, your cord, and your staff that is in your hand. That's a lot to ask for, it seemed to me. But obviously, he's, it's urgent, so he gives it to her and does what he comes there to do. And she conceives by him. And she rises and goes away and takes off her scarf, wearing her widow's clothes. All right, what are we going to make of this before we finish this story, folks?
It also said somewhere that prostitutes were not usually veiled, though, because otherwise any woman could sneak off and be a prostitute and nobody would know. So I wonder, doesn't clarify why he wasn't suspicious of why she was covered.
Because he's
Jacob.
Alone. Go ahead.
Yeah, her being out alone and unsupervised in a very public place just makes the assumption that for some reason she doesn't want her face seen, but she's prostituting herself. She's available for sex.
And of course, she's just doing that so Judah doesn't realize that it's Tamar. So, that's why it's a scarf, I think, instead of a veil, because there was a particular.
Actually, in the Tanakh, it is a veil.
It is a veil. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Thank you.
And surprised. It's a kid, not a goat.
That's right. Oh, yeah. And then, yeah. Cool. All right, cool. So it is Frymer-Kinsky's claim that Tamar ceases to be a victim and she's taking her destiny into her own hands. She sees an opportunity to act. And so let's see the conclusion of this, unless other folks have something that they want to lift up. I don't have any real notes.
Why wasn't she stoned to death?
Say that again.
Why
Different
wasn't
rules.
she stoned to death?
Oh,
Those are Arabic rules, not Semitic. Well, those are Arabic,
No.
current Arabic rules, as opposed to the classical.
Yeah, but wasn't the woman when Jesus says, whoever is
Who
without
is
sin,
sinless cast the first
right?
stone.
And they were going to stone her. They were dragging her out to stone her.
Yeah.
So that does seem to be part of Jewish.
It was at that point.
yes.
Later.
That doesn't mean it was at this point.
At
Yeah.
this point, but wouldn't she be outcast because she gets herself pregnant? And by who does she get herself? It's all supposed to be a mystery, right? She's doing this on the sly. She's not being open about it. And then all of a sudden she's knocked up. So, and whose baby is this?
Well, I think, those public forms, the essay I read on stoning particularly, it was meant to see if everyone is willing to actually participate in the execution, right? It wasn't just one person who participated. And in some ways it creates communal responsibility for the punishment. But yeah, a lot of the more ancient and the neighboring cultural stuff always makes it in to the biblical text, and we're not always sure why, but yeah. All right, let's continue reading this. I'm on 272 now. So Judah sent a goat or a kid by means of his friend Hira the Adullamite to retrieve his pledge from the woman. He didn't find her. He asked the people of her place, thus, where is the Kadesha, the one of Enaim on the road? They said, there was no Kadesha there. He returned to Judah and said, I didn't find her. And the local people said there was no Kadesha there. Judah said, take it from her lest we become a mockery. Look, I sent this goat and I didn't find her. And then I'll finish it down below. It happened after 3 months had passed. Thus was told to Judah, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been faithless, and what's more, look, she is pregnant from faithless acts. Take her out and let her be burned. She was being brought out, and she sent to her father-in-law thus, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. Recognize, please, to whom this seal and cord and staff belong. And Judah recognized and said, she has been more righteous than I, that for this I did not give her to Shelah, my son. He did not continue to know her carnally. So, what do we make of the reveal?
Well, she's smart, isn't she?
Very.
She had it all figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And he wanted the heir, so he wasn't gonna kill her after that, besides.
Yeah, but why was she considered what's righteous? Like, why was she?
Because she backed him into doing what was required. Either
Someone
the
in the
son,
family
the
was
third son had to get her pregnant, or the father had to.
That's right.
He declined. He wouldn't give his son. So her backing him into becoming the father and fulfilling the obligation made her the more righteous party.
Oh, that makes sense.
Mhm. Yep. And yeah, so let's get through to the end of this. We're just about there. And, Frymer-Kinsky lifts up that, this culture forces men in power to be really concerned about how they're perceived by others, because that's what either gives you honor or trouble. And that's why this notion of him not fulfilling a pledge is important. That's why, all these things are important. All right. Then this is on 274, and this is the last biblical text in this chapter. It happened at the time that she gave birth. Look, twins in her womb. And as she was birthing, one gave a hand. Yeah. And they pulled the hand back. The midwife took it and tied a scarlet thread onto his hand to say, this one came out first. Here we go, primogenitor all over again. And as he turned his hand back, look, his brother came out. She said, how have you broken through your breach? And he called his name Peretz. And afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet on his hand, and he called his name Zerah.
Scarlet.
Scarlet, which means scarlet in Hebrew. Awesome. That's right. And so we have, so who else has twins?
Oh, Abraham and Rebecca.
Rebecca, right? Jacob and Esau, right? And Jacob's holding on to Esau's foot as Esau's being born. And this one is even more clever. Sticks his hand completely out first, and so again, this is a whole lineage of tricksters, of folks who know how to get advantage, of folks who know the rules and know how to work them, even in the womb. Don't overlook that.
Smart kids.
Jacob and Zerah do this in the womb. It's just fascinating when you dial it down to that level. And so any questions or observations on the Tamar story?
And this isn't particularly about the Tamar story. I mean, I think this can apply for many of the tales, and just our conversation throughout the weeks is that I've been thinking a lot about, okay, so to your point about, tricksters and, folks that are, able to circumvent the rules or, have some kind of power in the moment. And it's just been helping me think through, and I've said it before, but where there are individuals in the tales that are empowered, right? Rather than like a group of people being empowered, or maybe they're representing, right, the power of a group. And then sort of thinking about where in the tales do we see women particularly acting collectively? So maybe we've seen that around going way back, right? In terms of the midwives, and the mothers, acting collectively in terms of killing, the male babies, and then thinking about, which we know we're not going to see because we've already been queued up, is women acting against, acting overtly against patriarchy, right? So we know that's, we shouldn't be looking for that, anyway, that just sort of been thinking about those different levels, right, of how the individuals in the tales, when they are victorious or, morally, right, righteous, is it at the individual level, collective level, and in what way? So that's just thoughts,
In this case, she did what was supposed to be done, though. I mean, it wasn't like she was being sneaky to do something to get around.
Yeah.
Like who's going to get the inheritance, because I think this one's better for it. She used her power to find a way to get what was supposed to be happen. Yeah.
Fascinating. And the other thing that Frymer-Kinsky really has a nice conversation on page 276, really talking about how a handful of the most important women in this part of Genesis, they all sort of come in to the fold. Tamar's from outside, Rachel and Leah are from outside, and others are from, and so this notion that, and yet they become the mothers of the patriarchs that follow, and so it's fascinating. That's what to me is always so glaring about what we read last week with Ezra being so worried about outsider wives, because the outsider wives are the mothers of the patriarchs and many of the patriarchs here in Genesis. So it's one of those biblical contradictions we will never figure out, except to say that, their agenda changed over the 400 years between when one text was written and the next.
Yeah, and am I wrong, or I may have missed something? Tamar was not given the word, right? She wasn't told, oh, you really have to do this by some angel or something. She did it
No.
on her own agency.
That's yeah, there's no, divine angel or anything saying, you should go here and do this. No, she is cunning and she's clever. She has determination and wits, and she's aggressive and she gets not just what she needs done, but what needs to happen for the family and for the history of these people to become who they become.
And also for her own status, because who wants to be sitting in a room all by themselves for the rest of their lives? And by having a child by Judah, who is in charge of the tribe, this gives her tremendous status.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Well, she's also producing the firstborn by proxy,
Right.
which child is automatically going to inherit.
Oh, right.
Yep, she's a kingmaker in that way. Yep. All right, let's see what we can get through in Dinah. And I don't expect to get through all of it, but this is quite a couple of stories, isn't it? Lots of sex and genocide and treachery and good God, movie of the week or something. All right,
The most pornographic book ever written.
All right, we're on page 179. All right, and Frymer-Kinsky starts off this chapter with the most obvious, at least with this crowd, sentence: patriarchy is about control. The man in power, patriarch and king, can determine the destiny of those under his rule. And that's what this story is about. And yet there's some unfortunate misses, I believe. I think Jacob regrets how this story ends in some ways in the end, but we'll get there. All right. Out went Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob, to see the girls of the land. Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, prince of the land, saw her. He took her and lay with her and degraded her. Let's stop right there, because Frymer-Kinsky goes at great lengths to suggest, and some of the text itself later on suggests, that this is not non-consensual. So I want to see how you all respond to that, unless you think we should read the next passage next.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Go ahead, Wendy.
No, I was just going to ask, what do you mean it sounds like it was a rape.
That's what it said.
The Tanaka states rape.
Say that again, Foxy.
The Tanaka states rape.
Oh, the Tanaka states rape, because what Frymer-Kinsky claims is that, so there may be, I just wonder about that translation, because where is, so this is, I'm glad I brought this up, and I'm glad you're here, Foxy, as always. The words for degrading, oh, here it is, it's on page 183. The story focuses on the illicit aspect of Shechem's action. He degraded her. The word inah, I-N-N-A-H, degrade, is a key word in both the sacred history and the story of Sarai and Hagar. It usually has nothing to do with sex and means to treat people without regard to the proper treatment that their status requires. The one biblical law that is explicitly and unequivocally about rape, lie with by force, the word inah does not appear. And in the story of Tamar and Ammon, which is a different story, where the issue is forcible rape, inah is augmented for clarity by the word overpower and by the order of the words. He overpowered her, degraded her, and lay with her. Word order counts. And rape, the word inah comes before the words lie with. In other forms of illicit sexual intercourse, inah comes after lay with. So that's an interesting, exegesis there, of the passage.
There's something else there that jumped out and bit me. She went out to the other girls.
Right.
Yeah.
Is this a newly pubescent child and nobody has noticed the fact that she has reached maidenhood, or what we would consider maidenhood now, except this person who's never seen her before, and her, in which case her going out to visit the other girls of her age is hardly inappropriate.
Yeah, and I appreciated FK's, analysis that if we're talking about a patriarchy, by some definitions, many of them, women wouldn't have had the status to consent. I mean, they're not full persons. They're, and so what women want is irrelevant. Whether they consent or not is beside the point. It's, they can, by definition, consent. I mean, that's also could be beside the point about whether or not we call this rape or not. But I think, what she's getting at is that, given some of the other language as well, is that, what the violation is that that there has been sex without the permission of her father, right?
Yeah.
Or the parent.
Yeah.
And that it's she was degraded in that now her status as a reflection of her family, right? And it shows that, dad's out of control, like the family's dishonored, which of course is totally still in many parts, parts of the world today, what's happening still. So that, the danger is not just for the young women in going out to look for the girls, but the danger is for the family in her going out because of what it can do.
Yes.
Again, I'm the cover band here. I'm not saying anything that isn't what we read, so that, because when I first read it without Frymer-Kinsky, I'm like, great. And then when I read her interpretation, like, oh, okay, well, right. If there's not, it's like sex, if we're thinking, does a 14-year-old right now have the ability to consent to sex? Would we legally, we consider that rape,
statutory rape at the very least.
Yeah, right. Anyway, so I'll leave it there, but just, yes.
So he degraded her father, her family, more than her, it almost seems like.
He dishonored the family. He degraded her he degraded her value.
Oh, as a marital. Yeah.
Yes, because remember, we're talking about a time in which bride price was huge. When you lost the use of the woman in the household to prepare the food, to keep the clothes clean, to do all the other things that women did, you had to pay for the privilege of taking her away. When she has been sexually compromised, her value drops precipitously. And so does his status. So does dad's status. And so does the status of her brothers.
That's right. And it's the
so
brothers.
Degrade has got a real dual meaning there. Not only degrade in the sense that we would think of somebody's reputation being degraded, but also financial degradation of her ability to recoup for the family her loss of what we would consider income.
What an amazing, and sick irony, right? That, women who are not very well valued in any other way, when it comes time to marry, they're expected to bring home a lot of money. There's the patriarchy writ large, and that's reality. Let's continue with the biblical story.
I'm not supporting the thing. I'm just.
I know. We're just pointing it out. For the record, this is just a spotlight.
And this may meta with the time that we have, but I know at the end of the chapter, the part of the chapter where FK is talking about, kind of theories of chastity and what that, and control and what might really have been the kind of function and kind of looking at the economic model and looking at the, labor model and kind of not rejecting them entirely, but looking them as like maybe not whole pictures, and that, it coming around to that it being really in terms of what we talked about earlier in the class, Rev Scott, around marking, right? Just the like, not that, right? And really coming back to the like, well, you have to set up some boundary, right? You know, in order to what would give men status is to be able to do that. And this happens to be the thing. But for me, I'm like, well, you still have to, that still has to be in the context of patriarchy, because it doesn't explain why the that then would have meaning if it weren't something that already was patriarchy. So again, that may be taking us too in the weeds of the argument, but it was totally interesting.
We will come back to that argument, you know, next week and the week after for sure. Now that's all important stuff to lift up. Let's finish the tale a little bit, because there's two. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Helen.
I found her talk, her musing on why virginity was so valued. I thought that was just fascinating. And just, that's all. Just
Any particular line you wanted to lift up, or?
Well, the famous one about a tight cunt or something that she put in there, delight in a tight cunt is ephemeral. I mean,
She's going with the porn. That's
It's probably good I'm on Zoom today. It's probably good I'm here on Zoom. That's all I'm saying.
I'm going to throw something out here because it applies to me. My first husband discovered that I wasn't a virgin after having told him no for 5 years. He was a little perturbed, to put it mildly. It was almost the end of the marriage. What he didn't know until I got him to calm down enough to listen was I'd had an accident at 5. And my virginity was removed by my doctor so he could put my pelvic bone back together. So by some standards, I was still a virgin.
so
The hymen was gone.
Well, because I never bled. I don't think, I'm pretty sure I never bled. I just didn't. I don't know. So
Yours may have been ruptured by something prior, or you may have had one that was so thin it just slid aside. Who knows? There are other proofs of virginity, and we also have other definitions of virginity. Because Mary was a virgin when she married Joseph, despite the fact that she was pregnant. At that time, a virgin was any woman who had not given birth.
Oh, really?
Really?
Oh, that's fascinating.
So even the definition of virginity has changed dramatically.
Then everybody who was a virgin pregnant person brought that on their first kid. What?
Yeah, well, you actually do have teenagers that get pregnant and are still technically hymen intact, because there was enough of a tear there, whether it was a poorly formed hymen or something happened and it was partially punctured, but the sperm managed to get through.
Well, we all know that's a ridiculous way to figure out if someone has.
Well, it also reflects dramatically on patriarchy, because when it comes down to it, you can't prove who the father is. You absolutely know who the mother is.
That's right. That's right. Control. Patriarchy is about control. All right. Let's see if we can finish this story. If not, that's fine. There's always next week. Thank you for all sharing so much. You guys shared a lot of stuff, and wow, appreciate that. You
let us.
Well, yeah.
So interesting.
So this comes right after the first bit, right after, and he degraded her. It's then his heart cleaved to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke to her heart. Shechem said to Hamor, his father, thus, "Get me this girl for my wife." Jacob heard that he had defiled his daughter. His sons were with the flocks in the field, and Jacob was silent until they would come. And just briefly, Frymer-Kinsky speaks about that term cleaved, his heart cleaved, and reminds us that that particular word, that phrase, was only used 8 times in the Bible. It's used by Ruth for Naomi, by Israel for God, and it's used in Genesis, be about, a man and woman becoming husband and wife. So it is meant to be sort of tender and intense. And then we learned that Shechem is a little bit quick to act before engaging his brain, it seems like. We're on page 190. And then out came Hamor, the father of Shechem, to speak to Jacob. Jacob's sons came from the field as they heard. The men were sad and very angry, for he had done an outrage in Israel by lying with the daughter of Jacob, and such is not to be done. Hamor spoke to them, Shechem, my son, his soul desires your daughter. Please give her to him as a wife. Intermarry with us, give us your daughters, and take our daughters for yourselves. Live with us. The land will be before you. Settle down or travel about. And then Shechem says, let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you tell me, I will give. And Frymer-Kinsky reminds us that, Shechem is a town. It's sort of settled. It's a small city. And as we've learned through these stories, Jacob's people, they have no land. They sort of travel from place to place, but they have no place that's their own. So Frymer-Kinsky seems to believe that this is really a genuine offer of value. So I'll just leave that as we finish the story, and then we'll finish with a discussion of the whole story, and whatever part you want to talk about is good. And Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit. They spoke because he had defiled their sister Dinah. They said to them, we cannot do this, give our sister to a man who has a foreskin, for that is a disgrace to us. But in this way, it may be agreeable for you. If you will be like us, circumcising all your males, then we will give our daughters to you and take your daughters, etc. These words seemed fine to Hamor and Shechem. The boy didn't delay to do the act. He goes right to it. Shechem does, for he really wanted the daughter of Jacob, and he was the most honored of all of his father's house. And so back on the bottom of page 192, to continue the story, Hamor and his son Shechem come to the gate, and they convince the whole town, all the men, that they need to be circumcised to do this thing. And then on page 194, and then here where we see the rest of the plan. It happened on the third day while they were in pain. Two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took each his sword. Now, Levi will become the father of the priestly class of Israel. So keep that in mind while reading what they do. Now the priest doesn't have wealth and land, but they have power. But so it's Simeon and Levi. They came upon the city lying securely and killed all the males. Hamor and Shechem, his son, they killed by the sword. They took Dinah from the house and went out, just as Dinah had gone out. The sons of Jacob came upon the corpses, despoiled the city that had defiled their sister, their sheep, cattle, asses, which were in the city and the fields. They took their staff and their children and their wives. They took captive, and they plundered what was in their homes. And Jacob doesn't think this was the smartest idea. He shares on on page 195, and then we'll conclude with the conversation and conclude the class. Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, you have brought trouble upon me, making me stink to all the inhabitants of the land and the Canaanites and the Perizzites. I am few in number, and they may gather against me and strike me, and I will be destroyed, I and my house. And the angry brothers, their only response is, shall they treat our sister as a whore? So, wow and wild. What do we make of this?
Well, no one cares whether Dinah fell in love with Shechem, right? I mean, no one cares about her feelings here. And
He has no voice.
And this is almost like something that you would see like in The Godfather or one of these like a Mark Wahlberg movie.
Or Ozark or any of those shows.
Or Ozark, right? where people, I love Ozark, by the way, where people just go berserkos. Some people have these tribal things going on in their minds where they, oh, we're going to get, our weapons against them, and they may not know that we're going to defend them in this way, but this is what we're going to do, and we don't care what the results are going to be, that because we have gone off and killed, everybody in view, doesn't mean that the cartel isn't going to come back and kill us, right? So we're still using this playbook, if not just for series like Ozark and The Godfather, but we're still using it. So
It's horrifying.
yeah.
About, what anybody care what Dinah thinks,
Yeah.
what she wanted, and she love him or not. I mean, because even if his heart cleaved for her, did her heart cleave for him? I mean, I don't know, but I appreciated FK's points around, the struggles of a people that do they want to unify? Do they want to remain separate? Like, what are the trade-offs? Like, whether you take the deal or don't take the deal. And here you have within, the brothers don't want the deal. The father maybe wants the deal. I mean, it speaks to this larger, women that and here's Dinah at the center, but it's not about Dinah. Dinah is the glue or not the glue. Either the feminine is the thing that brings men together, or the feminine of the thing that tears men apart. Which is it? We don't know.
Yes.
There's no answer.
The answer is yes.
Question. I have a quick question about the comment from Ben Sira, the Ben Sira wisdom comment, when women go out.
Oh,
And so I looked up Ben Sira, and I thought it was interesting that FK chose to put to add this in there. So can you say something about Ben Sira?
Ben Sira is a later text that isn't accepted by all Jews as canonical. And it comes at a time much like what we were reading last week, where they were very terrified of women from the outside, and they were terrified of their own women in ways that were particularly destructive. I think she's lifting that up to show that there was other strains of thought that included this kind of thinking about, just what Johanna was saying, are women what we should adore or what we should fear? And that's why I said the answer is yes, according to the biblical text, right? And I think the other thing that did you want to add anything to that, Nicole, before I share?
Thank you. Yes. I mean, first of all, thank you for that. Yes. As an add-on to that, there's also this entire lexicon of women who go out, right? I thought that was beautiful. Just all of the language, like gadabout or goer outer. And when you think about the power of language by associating just the act of physically going out with, with being somehow with having negative connotations, it completely hems women in, even beyond just the idea of seeking companionship with other people,
It's
I
so
think
foreign to our sensibility.
Not really, because there was a series of rapes or something where women were being really harassed in England, someplace in maybe it was London or something. And it was this whole thing of, oh, women need to stay at home. And then you got this group of feminists. This happened not too long ago, who said, no, who's harassing us? Men are harassing us. Men are the ones who are making the crime. So let them stay home, force them to stay in the house. So, and whenever women go out and God forbid get raped, whose fault is it? It's because they were not dressed properly. They were alone. They went into the bar. There are laws on the book that have recently been made that if a woman is drunk and she gets raped, too bad. It is her fault.
Oh, yeah.
And the man is not
Culpable.
prosecuted for it.
I meant to us, not the, yeah. I hear you. No, these troglodyte notions of how women should be are everywhere. So we can come back. We need to come back to that conversation. So let's make sure we come back to that. I just want to share two things about this story, to wrap my piece of it up. Number one, when I first read this story and realized it's basically about genocide, it was one of my last straws for being a Christian. It was one of my last straws for being, wanting to be involved in a Bible believing church, as a lot of my friends were growing up. As you know, I have a great love for the Bible now, but it took a long time and some training and life experience and et cetera. But one of the things I did learn about stories like this, especially in Genesis, is as much as it seems to glorify what it glorifies, it also is what it's doing. This is for the audience in the immediate time from when it was written, because everyone in that culture knew these stories. So to write the book of Genesis without including some of these stories that just seem heinous to us, including this one, they would have felt that the authors didn't know the history. So they had to put them in there to account for them. And, the weird thing about it accounting for them is they end up excusing it. There are passages later, not right after this, where they talk about that, they were, Jacob and his family were safe because a divine dread descended upon the other peoples. They were afraid to attack them. So this is how it ends up becoming justification for this kind of violence. And the narrators, and just trying to further the story along, and what happens to the family of Jacob, who ends up with the name Israel on that very journey. It's a big problem. And it's why so many people have such a strong reaction against the Bible, against the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's why, there are some folks in our congregation who, wonder why we talk about, these things so much. But, I think we know why we do. But I just want to, I don't want to pretend that's not the case. Because this is a particularly, awful tale. And, and its redeeming qualities seem to not exist. In fact, it seems to be part of the problem of the world that we live in today. So I just want to put that out there.
We need to know these stories, I feel, whether, I don't think I ever took them literally. I really don't, even in my high Roman Catholic days. But I think that because the Bible is so much part of our cultural language, that we just need to know these stories. I'll go back to the clip that I sent with Raz Baraka, and he's talking about, the gates of Jericho and so forth. And that audience knew what he was talking about.
That's right.
They knew what he was talking about, because I would assume it was a largely Black audience, an audience that was educated in the Black church primarily, where there's a lot of talk of these biblical stories. But there's, a whole lot of art that you don't understand without biblical references and so forth. And I just believe that's what we need to have.
All right, I'm going to send it back to Johanna, who started us off. If you want to tie us up in a bow, and then we can say goodnight to all the pretty people.
Well, it is so wonderful to see all the pretty people. So I don't have anything to tie it up neatly in a bow. Other than to say I totally appreciated what you just said, and also Reverend Scott about how we can try to parse through, what the biblical authors needed to do at the time to tell the tales, right, that they wanted to tell, and how that can, be useful for us to sort through. Some of you weren't on the call when Reverend Scott and I and Debbie were going back and forth a bit about, I can tie it up this way, about academic literature reviews and how some of us as academics are cursed with having to signal to the reader that this is what was, and we're not doing that, and you have to know this, and then we say what we need, and in an ironic way, I think that's what Red Scott was just saying about the lit reviews of the biblical authors, and so I appreciate all that tying it up. So, and I'll miss seeing everybody next week, and I promise it's doing something in the spirit of the UUs, but I can't be here. So,
Thank you very much, Johanna. Thank you, Reverend.
Feel better.
Bye.
Yeah,
Bye,
feel
guys.
better.
And
Bye-bye.
go watch basketball. Was that Nicole?
Feel better.
Oh yeah, I'm working on it. Go watch basketball.